You might think telling time has always been about gears, springs, and digital displays. But thousands of years ago, the Chinese were masters of something far more elegant. They turned the entire sky into their clock face, using nothing but shadows, flowing water, and the predictable dance of celestial bodies. While Europeans were still scratching marks on sundials that barely worked half the time, Chinese astronomers had already built timekeeping systems so sophisticated they could track minutes, regulate imperial ceremonies, and even predict eclipses with stunning accuracy. Picture this. It's ancient China, maybe around 200 BC, and you're standing in the Forbidden City watching a massive bronze instrument that looks like something between a telescope and a piece of abstract art. This isn't just decoration, it's a precision timekeeping device that can tell you not just what hour it is, but exactly how many minutes have passed since dawn. The whole thing works without a single gear, spring, or mechanical part. Instead, it uses something far more reliable: the movement of our entire solar system. Here's what makes this story fascinating. The Chinese didn't just stumble onto good timekeeping by accident. They needed it desperately. Running an empire the size of modern-day China meant coordinating everything from tax collection to military campaigns across distances that would take months to travel. If your army showed up 3 days late because nobody could agree on what time it was, you might find your empire suddenly becoming someone else's empire. Time wasn't just convenient, it was survival. The foundation of Chinese timekeeping started with something deceptively simple: shadows. But these weren't your backyard sundial variety. Chinese shadow clocks were engineering marvels that would make modern clockmakers weep with envy. The basic principle sounds easy enough. Stick a pole in the ground and watch its shadow move as the sun travels across the sky. Simple. Right? Wrong. Try building one that works accurately across different seasons, in different locations, and can measure time down to fractions of an hour. Chinese astronomers figured out that the length and direction of shadows changed predictably throughout the day and across the seasons. They created shadow clocks called gnomon that weren't just sticks in the ground. They were carefully calculated instruments with precisely angled surfaces and mathematically determined proportions. A typical gnomon stood about 8 feet tall and cast shadows onto marked stone platforms that could measure time intervals as short as 15 minutes. The math behind these calculations would challenge modern engineering students. But here's where things get really interesting. Different cities across China needed different gnomon designs because the Earth isn't flat and the sun hits different latitudes at different angles. A shadow clock that worked perfectly in Beijing would be completely wrong in Shanghai. Chinese astronomers had to create custom timekeeping instruments for each major city, calculating the precise angles and measurements needed for that specific location. They were basically creating a network of synchronized time zones centuries before anyone else even understood the concept. The most impressive shadow clocks weren't just poles casting shadows, they were architectural masterpieces. Some were built into the walls of important buildings, with elaborate bronze fixtures that cast multiple shadows onto different scales. Others were portable instruments that traveling officials could carry to remote provinces, ensuring that imperial business operated on consistent time schedules, no matter where they went. One famous shadow clock from the Tang dynasty was so accurate that it could measure the difference between solar time and what we now call mean time, the small daily variations in the sun's apparent movement caused by Earth's slightly elliptical orbit. Winter presented a special challenge for shadow-based timekeeping. When the sun hung low in the sky during cold months, shadows became incredibly long and hard to read accurately. Chinese engineers solved this with something called reflecting sundials, polished bronze mirrors that could capture and redirect sunlight even on overcast days. These weren't simple mirrors either. They were curved and angled to compensate for the sun's changing position throughout the year, creating clear shadow marks even when direct sunlight was weak or intermittent. The precision of these instruments was absolutely mind-boggling. Archaeological evidence shows that some Chinese shadow clocks could maintain accuracy within minutes across entire seasons. To put that in perspective, European sundials from the same period were often off by hours, and most couldn't function at all during winter months or cloudy weather. Chinese shadow clocks worked year-round in almost any weather conditions, and maintained accuracy that wouldn't be matched in Europe until mechanical clocks appeared centuries later. But relying solely on shadows had obvious limitations. What happened at night? What about during storms when clouds blocked the sun for days? That's where Chinese ingenuity really shined. They developed complementary timekeeping systems that worked when shadows couldn't. The most famous of these was the water clock, though calling it just a water clock is like calling a symphony just some music. Chinese water clocks weren't simple containers with holes in the bottom. They were complex hydraulic systems with multiple chambers, overflow mechanisms, and precision-engineered flow rates. The basic principle involved water flowing from one container to another at a carefully controlled rate. As water levels changed, they revealed time markings on the container walls. Sounds straightforward, but the engineering challenges were enormous. Water doesn't flow at consistent rates unless everything is perfectly controlled. Temperature changes affect flow speed. Hot water moves faster than cold water. Air pressure variations can speed up or slow down the flow. Even the size of the hole matters enormously. Make it slightly too large, and your clock runs fast. Too small, and it runs slow. Chinese engineers had to account for all these variables while creating instruments that remained accurate for months at a time. The most sophisticated water clocks used what's called the constant level principle. Instead of simply letting water drain from one container, they created systems where water flowed between multiple chambers, maintaining consistent pressure and flow rates regardless of how much water remained in the system. Some of these clocks had up to 4 separate chambers, each precisely calibrated to maintain accuracy under different conditions. The engineering was so advanced that these clocks could run continuously for weeks without adjustment. Nighttime brought its own set of challenges and opportunities for Chinese astronomers. While shadows disappeared after sunset, the stars provided an entirely different kind of clock, one that was actually more reliable than the sun. In some ways, Chinese star maps from over 2,000 years ago show constellations divided into precise time segments. By watching which stars appeared at the horizon, astronomers could determine not just the hour, but the exact time down to small fractions. The Chinese developed something called the armilosphere, a bronze instrument that looked like a giant skeletal globe covered in rings and measurement marks. Astronomers would align this device with specific stars and planets, using their positions to calculate precise time measurements. The math involved was staggering. They had to account for the Earth's rotation, the apparent movement of stars throughout the year, and even tiny variations in planetary positions. Yet these instruments could determine time more accurately than most mechanical clocks that came centuries later. What made Chinese timekeeping truly revolutionary wasn't just the individual instruments, it was how they all worked together as a coordinated system. Shadow clocks handled daytime hours, water clocks managed nighttime and cloudy periods, and astronomical instruments provided calibration and verification for both imperial officials could cross-reference multiple timekeeping methods to ensure accuracy, creating a redundancy that made Chinese timekeeping incredibly reliable. The implications went far beyond simply knowing what time it was. Accurate timekeeping allowed Chinese civilization to coordinate activities across vast distances, plan agricultural activities with precision, and regulate everything from court ceremonies to market schedules. This coordination created something unprecedented in human history, a civilization that operated like clockwork across thousands of miles. The Chinese imperial calendar wasn't just a list of dates. It was a massive logistical operation that synchronized everything from harvest schedules to military campaigns. Provincial governors received detailed timetables that told them exactly when to collect taxes, when to hold festivals, and when to expect imperial messengers miss your timing by more than a day, and you might find yourself explaining to the emperor why his grain shipments were late. The scale of this operation was absolutely staggering. Imagine trying to coordinate the schedules of millions of people spread across a territory larger than modern Europe, using nothing but messengers on horseback and timekeeping instruments that relied on shadows and flowing water. Yet somehow, it worked. Chinese records from the Han Dynasty show that imperial ceremonies in distant provinces were synchronized to within hours of events happening in the capital, a feat that wouldn't be matched anywhere else in the world for over 1,000 years. But here's where the story gets really wild. Chinese astronomers weren't content with just measuring time. They wanted to predict it. They developed instruments that could forecast celestial events months or even years in advance. The most famous of these was something called the cosmic engine, a bronze mechanical calculator that used a combination of gears and water power to model the movements of planets and stars. This wasn't just about telling time anymore. It was about understanding time itself as part of the fundamental structure of the universe. The cosmic engine looked like something you might find in a steampunk museum, a collection of bronze rings, wheels, and chambers all connected by an intricate system of flowing water. As water moved through the device, it turned wheels that represented different celestial bodies. The positions of these wheels could tell astronomers exactly where planets would appear in the sky on any given date, sometimes years in the future. One surviving example from the Song dynasty could predict lunar eclipses with accuracy that modern computers would be proud of. Creating these instruments required mathematical knowledge that was centuries ahead of its time. Chinese astronomers had to calculate the orbital periods of planets, account for the precession of Earth's axis, and even factor in tiny variations in the moon's orbit. They developed trigonometric functions, calculated pi to dozens of decimal places, and created astronomical tables that remained the most accurate in the world until the Renaissance. All of this mathematical wizardry was driven by their obsession with precise timekeeping. The social implications were just as revolutionary as the technical achievements. In most ancient civilizations, only priests or royalty had access to accurate timekeeping. But Chinese shadow clocks and water clocks began appearing in markets, government buildings, and even private homes. Ordinary merchants could schedule meetings, farmers could time their planting with precision, and workers could coordinate their shifts. For the first time in human history, precise time wasn't a luxury reserved for the elite. It was becoming a basic tool of civilization. This democratization of timekeeping changed how Chinese society operated at every level. Legal proceedings had to start and end at specific times. Market hours were standardized across entire regions. Even social customs began revolving around precise scheduling rather than vague approximations. Chinese poetry from this period is filled with references to specific hours and time measurements, showing how deeply time consciousness had penetrated everyday culture. People weren't just living through time anymore. They were living by time. The most impressive installations weren't individual clocks, but entire timekeeping complexes that covered acres of ground. The Imperial Observatory in Kaifeng was basically a timekeeping city, with dozens of different instruments all cross-referencing each other to maintain perfect accuracy. Water flowed between multiple buildings, shadows were cast across courtyards the size of football fields, and bronze astronomical instruments tracked the movements of celestial bodies day and night. Walking through one of these complexes would have been like stepping into a time machine, not to travel through time, but to see time itself made visible and tangible. Water gurgled through channels carved into marble floors. Massive sundials cast precise shadows onto intricate stone carvings, and bronze armillary spheres slowly rotated to match the movement of stars overhead. The whole complex operated like a giant mechanical symphony, with each instrument playing its part in the grand composition of a measured time. The maintenance of these systems required an entire class of specialized technicians. Timekeepers weren't just operators, they were master craftsmen who understood hydraulics, astronomy, metallurgy, and advanced mathematics. Training to become an imperial astronomer took decades and involved memorizing star charts, mastering complex calculations, and learning to fabricate precision bronze instruments using techniques that were closely guarded state secrets. These timekeepers held enormous power in Chinese society. They didn't just measure time, they essentially controlled it. Imperial edicts were dated according to their calculations, agricultural schedules followed their recommendations, and even military campaigns were planned around their astronomical predictions. In a very real sense, these astronomers held the rhythm of an entire civilization in their hands. The accuracy they achieved was remarkable by any standard. Historical records show that Chinese astronomical predictions from over 1,000 years ago were often correct to within minutes. They could predict solar eclipses decades in advance, calculate the exact timing of seasonal changes, and even account for tiny variations in Earth's rotation that modern science didn't discover until the 20th century. Their instruments were so precise that when Jesuit missionaries arrived in China centuries later, they found Chinese astronomical data that was more accurate than anything available in Europe. But maintaining this level of precision came with challenges that would make modern engineers break out in a cold sweat. Imagine trying to keep dozens of water clocks running accurately when the water supply depended on seasonal rainfall, when bronze components expanded and contracted with temperature changes, and when a single miscalculation could throw off the timing for an entire province. Chinese timekeepers developed maintenance schedules that were more complex than the instruments themselves. Every water clock needed daily attention. The flow holes had to be cleaned with specially designed tools. Too much scraping and you'd make the hole too large, ruining the timing forever. Too little cleaning and mineral deposits would slow the water flow, making the clock run slow. Some maintenance required completely dismantling multi-chamber systems, cleaning each component separately, then reassembling everything with tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. One surviving maintenance manual from the Tang dynasty lists over 200 different steps for properly servicing a single water clock. The bronze components presented their own nightmares. Metal expands when it heats up and contracts when it cools down. A fact that could turn a perfectly accurate instrument into expensive scrap metal if not properly managed. Chinese engineers developed bronze alloys specifically designed for timekeeping instruments, mixing copper, tin, and other metals in ratios that minimized thermal expansion. They even created seasonal adjustment procedures, physically altering instrument settings to compensate for temperature changes throughout the year, whether through constant curveballs at the entire system. A heavy rainstorm could flood water clock chambers, disrupting flow rates for weeks. Extreme cold could freeze the water entirely, while extreme heat could evaporate it faster than expected. Chinese timekeepers became expert meteorologists by necessity, learning to predict weather patterns and adjust their instruments accordingly. Some installations included covered pavilions and underground chambers specifically designed to protect timekeeping equipment from environmental extremes. The most challenging aspect wasn't technical, it was human. These instruments required operators who understood not just how to read them, but how to maintain, calibrate, and repair them. Training programs for imperial astronomers were essentially universities focused entirely on timekeeping science. Students spent years learning to calculate celestial mechanics, master bronze-working techniques, and memorize the maintenance procedures for dozens of different instruments. The dropout rate was enormous because the margin for error was essentially zero. But when everything worked properly, the results were magical. Chinese cities operated with a precision that wouldn't be seen anywhere else for centuries. Court ceremonies began exactly on schedule. Market hours were standardized across vast regions, and even everyday activities like meals and work shifts followed precise timing. Foreign visitors were amazed to find that Chinese officials could schedule meetings weeks in advance and actually stick to the planned times, something that was virtually impossible in most other civilizations. The ripple effects extended into areas you'd never expect. Chinese medicine developed precise timing for treatments, recognizing that certain herbs worked better when administered at specific times of day. Agricultural practices became incredibly sophisticated, with planting and harvesting schedules calculated down to optimal hours rather than just approximate seasons. Even military tactics evolved around precise timing, with coordinated attacks planned to the minute across multiple battlefronts. The instruments themselves became works of art, as much as scientific tools. Master craftsmen spent months creating bronze astronomical spheres, with intricate decorative patterns that also served functional purposes. The decorations weren't just pretty, they were part of the measurement system, with elaborate dragon motifs and cloud patterns that indicated specific time divisions. Looking at these instruments today, it's hard to believe they were built over 1,000 years ago. They look like they belong in a modern science museum, rather than ancient Chinese courtyards. Some installations pushed the boundaries of what seemed physically possible. The Great Clock Tower of Kaifeng stood over 100 feet tall and contained multiple timekeeping systems working in coordination. Water flowed through channels carved into different levels of the tower. Shadow casting devices operated on multiple floors, and astronomical instruments crowned the entire structure. The whole building was essentially one enormous clock that could be seen and heard for miles around. Bells chimed on the hour. Water could be heard flowing through the walls, and the shadow patterns on the ground changed visibly as the day progressed. The intellectual achievement behind these systems was staggering. Chinese astronomers had to master mathematics that wouldn't be rediscovered in Europe until the Renaissance. They calculated planetary orbits, understood the relationship between Earth's rotation and stellar positions, and even accounted for the gradual shift in Earth's axis that takes thousands of years to complete. All of this mathematical sophistication was driven by their practical need for accurate timekeeping across a massive empire. Regional variations added another layer of complexity. Each major city needed instruments calibrated for its specific latitude and longitude. A water clock designed for Beijing would run differently in Guangzhou because of variations in atmospheric pressure and humidity. Shadow clocks had to account for local terrain features that might block sunlight at certain times of day. Chinese engineers created installation manuals that were essentially customized for each location, with detailed instructions for adapting standard designs to local conditions. The economic impact was profound. Accurate timekeeping enabled Chinese merchants to coordinate trade routes across thousands of miles, schedule cargo deliveries, and synchronize market activities between distant cities. Agricultural productivity increased dramatically when farmers could time their planting and harvesting with precision rather than guesswork. Even tax collection became more efficient when provincial officials could coordinate their activities according to standardized schedules, rather than vague seasonal approximations. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect was how these ancient Chinese innovations influenced timekeeping traditions that persist today. The concept of dividing the day into precisely measured hours, the idea of coordinating activities across large geographical areas, and even basic techniques for calibrating timekeeping instruments. All of these trace their origins back to Chinese shadow clocks and water clocks from over 2,000 years ago. The legacy extends beyond just timekeeping technology. Chinese approaches to systematic observation, precise measurement, and coordinated record-keeping became fundamental principles of scientific method. Their astronomical data remained the most accurate available anywhere in the world for over a millennium, and their mathematical techniques for calculating celestial mechanics influenced scientific development across Asia and eventually reached Europe through trade routes. Standing in modern Beijing today, surrounded by digital clocks and GPS-synchronized smartphones, it's mind-boggling to realize that the same city once operated according to bronze instruments and flowing water systems that were just as accurate as anything we use today. Those ancient Chinese astronomers didn't just tell time, they created time as we understand it, turning the chaotic flow of days and seasons into the precisely measured rhythm that drives modern civilization. The genius wasn't just in individual instruments, it was in how they all talked to each other. Chinese timekeepers developed what we'd recognize today as quality control systems, constantly cross-referencing multiple instruments to catch errors before they could cascade through the entire network. If a water clock started running slow, operators would check it against the nearest shadow clock. If both disagreed with the astronomical observations, they'd know something needed immediate attention. This redundancy saved the empire from countless disasters. Imagine if your GPS started giving you wrong directions, but you had two other navigation systems that could immediately tell you something was wrong. That's essentially what Chinese astronomers built, except they did it with bronze and flowing water instead of satellites and computer chips. The most sophisticated installations had up to 7 different timekeeping methods, all monitoring each other for accuracy. The psychological impact on Chinese society was just as revolutionary as the technical achievements. For the first time in human history, ordinary people began thinking about time as something that could be measured, saved, and even wasted. Chinese literature from this period shows a dramatic shift in how people described their daily activities. Instead of saying, when the sun was high, people started saying, at the 7th hour. Instead of sometime during the harvest season, they'd specify exact dates and times for agricultural activities. This precision mindset spread into every aspect of Chinese culture. Craftsmen began timing their work processes to optimize efficiency. Cooks developed recipes with precise timing for each step. Even social customs evolved around exact scheduling rather than rough approximations. Chinese tea ceremonies, martial arts training, and meditation practices all incorporated specific timing elements that required accurate timekeeping instruments to execute properly. The military applications were particularly impressive. Chinese generals could coordinate attacks across multiple fronts with timing precision that wouldn't be matched anywhere else for centuries. Battle plans included exact schedules down to the quarter hour, with different units expected to begin their movements at precisely calculated moments. Signal fires, drum beats, and horn calls were all timed to coordinate with astronomical observations, creating a communication system that could synchronize military activities across hundreds of miles. One famous battle during the Song dynasty involved 3 separate armies attacking from different directions, with their movements timed to converge on the enemy position at exactly the same moment. The coordination required astronomical calculations to account for varying travel times, terrain difficulties, and even weather delays. When the attack succeeded perfectly, enemy commanders couldn't understand how Chinese forces had achieved such impossible timing. The secret was their timekeeping technology, which allowed military precision that seemed almost supernatural to outside observers. But the real magic happened when Chinese engineers started combining different timekeeping principles into hybrid instruments. They created devices that used flowing water to power mechanical components, which in turn adjusted shadow casting elements based on seasonal changes. These weren't just clocks anymore. They were adaptive machines that could modify their own behavior to maintain accuracy under changing conditions. The most famous example was called the cosmic mirror, a device that used water pressure to automatically adjust the angles of bronze mirrors throughout the day. As the sun moved across the sky, the changing water levels would gradually reposition reflective surfaces to maintain consistent shadow patterns on the reading scales. The entire system was essentially self-calibrating, adjusting its own accuracy without human intervention. Modern engineers study surviving examples of these devices and still can't fully understand how they achieved such sophisticated automation using only water pressure and bronze components. Temperature compensation became an obsession for Chinese instrument makers. They discovered that bronze components would expand in summer heat and contract in winter cold, throwing off the precision of their measurements. So they developed bronze alloys with different expansion rates, creating components that would counteract each other's thermal changes. Some instruments used multiple metals working against each other, with copper elements expanding while iron elements contracted, keeping the overall instrument geometry stable regardless of temperature changes. The most ambitious project was something called the Imperial Time Network, an attempt to synchronize accurate timekeeping across the entire Chinese empire. Master astronomers would calculate precise correction factors for different cities based on their geographical positions, seasonal variations, and local environmental conditions. These corrections were then distributed to provincial timekeepers through an elaborate courier system that was faster and more reliable than most modern mail services. Imagine trying to keep thousands of clocks synchronized across a territory the size of modern China, using nothing but horseback messengers and mathematical calculations performed by hand. Yet somehow, Chinese timekeepers managed to maintain synchronization accurate to within hours across distances that took months to travel. Provincial governors would receive quarterly updates with correction factors for their local instruments, allowing them to maintain coordination with imperial schedules despite being thousands of miles from the capital. The courier system itself became a marvel of logistics. Timekeeping corrections were so important that they received priority over almost everything else, including military dispatches and tax collection orders. Specially trained messengers memorized the numerical corrections rather than carrying written documents that might be lost or damaged. Some courier routes included relay stations where fresh messengers would take over, ensuring that timekeeping data could travel faster than any other information in the ancient world. Quality control reached almost obsessive levels. Chinese timekeepers developed testing procedures that would impress modern manufacturing standards. New instruments underwent months of evaluation, with their accuracy checked against multiple reference standards under different weather conditions and seasons. Only devices that maintained precision within acceptable tolerances were approved for official use. The rejection rate was enormous. Historical records suggest that up to 60% of newly manufactured instruments failed their accuracy tests and had to be scrapped or completely rebuilt. The next time you glance at your smartphone to check the time, remember those ancient Chinese astronomers who turned the entire universe into their timepiece. They didn't need satellites, quartz crystals, or atomic precision, just bronze, water, shadows, and an obsession with accuracy that bordered on the supernatural. While we tap screens for instant time updates, they built instruments so precise they could predict eclipses centuries in advance and coordinate an empire across thousands of miles using nothing but flowing water and celestial mathematics. These weren't just ancient curiosities gathering dust in museums. They were the foundation of how we think about time itself. Every scheduled meeting, every coordinated activity, every moment of precision in our modern world traces back to those bronze spheres casting shadows in ancient Chinese courtyards. Time wasn't invented by Swiss watchmakers or digital engineers. It was perfected by astronomers who understood that the rhythm of civilization itself depended on their ability to capture the movement of the heavens and transform it into something as reliable as the sunrise.